If you slap me tonight, Dad, I swear it'll be the last thing you ever get away with." The words slipped out before I even realized they were mine, hanging in the scented air of vanilla candles and jazz piano drifting through the grand ballroom at the Ocean Crest Resort in Cape Cod. All around me, people were laughing, holding champagne flutes high under crystal chandeliers. But my pulse pounded like war drums in my ears. I caught my reflection in the glass doors leading out to the balcony. Red silk dress, dark hair pinned in perfect waves, lipstick flawless. I looked every inch the glowing bride-to-be people expected me to be, except my jaw was clenched so tight I could taste copper at the back of my throat. My name is Madison Carter. I'm 28 years old, born and raised in Boston, and for the past 10 years, I've fought tooth and nail to build a life I could call my own. I work as a senior coordinator for a nonprofit that fights housing insecurity for women. And most days, that work keeps me sane. Until nights like this, because no matter how hard I try to outrun my last name, the Carter family always finds a way to pull me back in, reminding me that blood isn't thicker than betrayal. My fiancé, Ethan Walker, stood beside me, one hand resting protectively on the small of my back. He's 32, a software engineer who has a grin that makes strangers instantly trust him. He squeezed my side gently, whispering, "You okay?" I forced a tight smile. "I'm fine." I lied, scanning the glittering crowd. I could see my parents, Charles and Donna Carter, floating among guests like seasoned politicians, smiling and shaking hands. Charles with his tailored navy suit and stern posture. Donna adjusting her diamond pendant every few seconds as though it were armor. Near the dessert table, my older brother Brandon stood with a bourbon in one hand, laughing far too loudly at something his fiancée, Sophia Blake, was saying. Sophia, with her honey blonde hair and soft green eyes, wore an ivory gown that shimmered like pearls under the chandeliers. She came from old Boston money. The Blakes owned half the high-rises downtown, and her presence tonight was more than just decorative. She was the bridge my family was counting on, the alliance that would supposedly elevate the Carters to some higher rung of society. As I watched them all, my stomach turned. Tonight was supposed to be about Ethan and me, about the life we were building together, but I knew better. Because 2 weeks ago, my parents called me into their living room, sat me down under the soft glow of our old family lamp, and asked me to do the one thing that would shatter every plan I'd ever made for my future. And even now, standing in the middle of my own engagement party, the words my father said that night echoed inside my head like a cruel refrain. "Madison, your brother deserves that wedding at Ocean Crest far more than you'll ever need a fancy ceremony. Give him the money. Be a good sister." I swallowed hard, shoving the memory down. But the truth was, no matter how many smiles I faked tonight, something dark was brewing beneath the chandeliers. And I had a feeling this party was about to become the scene of a family war no one would ever forget. I remember exactly how it started. Charles Carter, my father, sitting across from me in our living room, the leather creaking under his weight, the late afternoon light casting sharp lines across his face. He cleared his throat, fingers drumming on the mahogany armrest like a ticking clock. "Madison, your brother needs your help," he said. His voice carried that forced calm he always used when he was about to drop a bomb. Donna Carter, my mother, perched beside him, legs crossed, her manicured fingers twisting the gold chain around her neck. She gave me that gentle, trembling smile that was anything but gentle. "Sweetheart, you know how important Brandon's wedding is? To all of us?" I blinked at them, still in my blazer and slacks from work, an iced coffee sweating onto my knee. "Important," how I said. Donna inhaled sharply, as if my question itself was an act of defiance. "It's not just about Brandon and Sophia," she said. "This marriage, it's about connections. business, status. The Blakes are powerful people. This could open so many doors for your brother. And for this family. Charles leaned forward. Sophia's parents are expecting a certain kind of wedding. Brandon wants to give it to her. He deserves that. But he's stretched. And that's where you come in. I set the coffee down, slowly, afraid I'd throw it. Come in, How. The trust fund, Charles said. His voice dropped low, like we were discussing state secrets. I felt my chest tighten. My trust fund. Donna reached for my hand. Your grandfather left you $150,000 for your wedding or your future. You've barely touched it. You and Ethan don't even have a date set yet. I yanked my hand back. That money is for me, I snapped. And for Ethan, it's not a family piggy bank. Charles's eyes hardened, lips flattening into a line. Madison, your brother is the face of this family. He's worked hard. He's a doctor. He's marrying into one of the most respected families in Boston. You're working in charity. The way he spat out the word charity made me feel like dirt. I'm working in nonprofit housing advocacy. I shot back. I'm helping people who have no voice. That matters. Donna sighed, looking like I'd just admitted to dealing drugs. Be reasonable, she pleaded. We're not asking you to give it away. Just lend it. You and Ethan could still have a small wedding. Maybe in the backyard. Intimate. You've never been flashy. Maddie. I stared at them, my vision blurring at the edges. You want me to give up my wedding? So Brandon can throw a spectacle for the Blakes. Charles slammed his palm on the armrest so hard that the coffee sloshed over the rim. It's not about you. Madison, he barked. It's about family, about loyalty. You think Sophia's parents want to see our son getting married in some community center? They'd pull the plug on the whole thing. Donna was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks. Please, honey, don't ruin this for your brother. You're the only one who can help. I felt something cold and jagged snap in my chest. Let me get this straight, I said, voice shaking. You're asking me to sacrifice the future I've been planning for years, so Brandon can impress a bunch of people who don't even know my name. Neither of them answered. I stood up so quickly. The coffee tumbled onto the carpet, spreading a dark stain across the cream fibers. Charles stood too, towering over me. Don't walk away from me, young lady, he snarled. You owe this family. Everything you have came from us. I squared my shoulders. I owe you nothing that costs me my own life. I stormed out, Donna calling my name, Charles cursing under his breath. And for 2 weeks, the house turned into a silent battleground. Donna tried sweet phone calls, gentle sobbing voicemails. Charles resorted to threats, rattling off all the things he'd done for me since I was a baby. Brandon didn't bother calling me at all. Instead, I'd catch him at family dinners glaring at me like I'd spit in his food. Even the relatives started weighing in. An aunt texting me, just help your brother. It's only money. Blood is forever. I wanted to scream. Because if blood was forever, why did mine feel like it was turning to ice every time I looked at my father? Ethan tried to hold me together, telling me over and over, this is your life, not theirs. You don't owe them your future. But the deeper I sank into the quiet hostility swirling around my family, the more I started wondering if any of them had ever loved me for me, or if I'd always just been a convenient bargaining chip waiting for the day they'd finally cash me in. And somehow, through it all, I knew the storm wasn't over. Not even close. I felt the shift in the air the second Brandon walked into the ballroom. It was like the temperature dropped 10 degrees, even though the chandeliers were burning hot overhead. I smelled the bourbon before I saw his face. He stumbled slightly, tossing his navy blazer over a chair, tie loosened, hair a mess. His cheeks were flushed pink, his eyes glassy, scanning the room as though he was the guest of honor. Sophia trailed behind him, her expression tight, Her lips pressed into a thin, polite smile as she tried to smooth his shirt collar. But Brandon shrugged her off and strode straight toward the bar, ordering another bourbon, neat, in a voice loud enough for half the room to hear. The jazz band played on, oblivious. But I felt Ethan stiffen beside me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I tried to pretend I hadn't noticed, but I could feel my father's eyes burning into me from across the dance floor. Charles Carter was standing next to the mayor of Boston, shaking hands. But his focus was locked on me like a sniper sight. I didn't have time to move before he started making his way over, maneuvering through the guests with an expression so calm it made my stomach twist. He arrived at my side, towering over me, his smile cold. "Madison, we need to talk." I forced a brittle laugh. "Dad, now's not exactly now," he growled, low enough that only I and Ethan could hear. Ethan stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, this isn't the time or the place." But Charles shoved Ethan back with a single hard push to his chest. "Stay out of this." Ethan caught himself, his hands up in surrender, but the entire room seemed to pause, eyes swinging toward us like spotlights. Donna was hurrying over, a fake smile plastered on her face as she whispered to the nearby guests, "Just a little family misunderstanding. Enjoy your drinks." But Brandon was watching from the bar, sipping his bourbon with a smirk. Charles grabbed my arm, fingers digging into my flesh so hard I knew there'd be bruises later. "You selfish brat," he hissed, his breath hot with anger. "You owe your brother everything, and this party, you don't deserve any of it." My eyes widened as I tried to pull free. "Dad, you're embarrassing yourself." "No," he thundered, his voice rising above the music. "You're embarrassing this family." And then, before I could even blink, he slapped me, open-palmed right across the face, with a crack that echoed off the marble floors. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. I staggered sideways, clutching my cheek, the sting blazing across my skin. My earring flew off, skittering across the floor, sparkling under the lights like some shattered piece of my dignity. Silence fell so thick, it felt like I was underwater. For a single breathless moment, no one moved. Not the guests, not the band, not even Brandon, who froze mid-sip, eyes wide. And then a few phones came up, cameras blinking red. I could taste blood in my mouth. Donna reached for me, but her face wasn't horrified. It was panicked, like she was trying to gauge how much damage control she'd need to do. Brandon finally stepped forward, laughing nervously. "Come on, Dad, it's not that serious." But Charles spun on him. "Shut up! This is your fault, too." Ethan rushed to my side, gripping my shoulders, voice trembling. "Charles, you just hit your daughter." "She brought it on herself," Charles shouted, pointing at me like I was a disease. "She's ungrateful. We raised her, gave her everything, and this is how she repays us." The guests were murmuring, shifting uncomfortably, some looking away, others recording with their phones. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. I stared at my father, at the veins bulging in his neck, at the man who'd once carried me on his shoulders at the 4th of July parade, screaming with joy as fireworks lit up the sky. That man was gone. And all I saw now was someone who'd decided I was disposable the second I stopped being useful. I blinked slowly, my cheek still throbbing. Then I turned to Ethan and whispered, "Let's go." He didn't even hesitate. He wrapped his arm around me, guiding me through the stunned crowd, past the floral centerpieces and discarded champagne glasses. People parted for us like water, whispering, eyes wide. Donna reached for me one last time. "Madison, wait!" But I didn't look back. The music had stopped entirely, leaving only the echo of my heels on the marble floor. Outside the ballroom, the salt air hit me like a slap of ice. Ethan led me toward the parking lot, his hand trembling where it held mine. Behind us, The doors swung shut, muffling the roar of hushed arguments and gossip starting to bloom like wildfire. I didn't cry. Not yet, because something inside me was twisting, transforming, and I knew one thing for sure. If they wanted a war, I was damn well going to give them one. The drive back to Boston that night was silent. Ethan kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other wrapped firmly around mine, his thumb brushing over my knuckles as if trying to rub away the memory of my father's hand across my face. I stared out the window at the blur of highway lights, my cheeks still pulsing with a dull ache. Inside my chest, something coiled tighter with every mile. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was something sharper. Something like steel. By the time we reached our apartment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Ethan unlocked the door and flicked on the lights. The soft glow fell over our bookshelf, the framed photos of us hiking in Vermont, the potted plants I kept forgetting to water. He gently turned me toward him, his eyes scanning my face as if he might find the mark of my father's fingers still etched into my skin. "You sure you're okay?" he whispered. I nodded, even though my throat felt like it might close up. "I need a minute," I said. I slipped into the bedroom and closed the door behind me. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the familiar scent of Ethan's cologne lingering in the sheets. Then I crossed to the closet, knelt down, and reached for the lockbox I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a slim folder, thick legal paper bound with a faded red ribbon. I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly, and laid it across the bed. I remembered the day my grandfather gave it to me. I'd been 20, home from college for the summer. He'd taken me aside one afternoon, out on the porch overlooking the Boston harbor, his voice low and serious. "Madison, blood can betray you faster than strangers. Keep your own name on what matters." At the time, I thought he was just rambling like he sometimes did, but he'd given me this folder anyway. And now, staring down at the crisp lettering on the first page, I finally understood why. It was a property deed. Title holder Madison Carter. Location 26 Parkside Avenue, Beacon Hill, Boston. My parents' house, my childhood home. A wave of shock rolled through me so hard, I had to grip the edge of the mattress to stay upright. I flipped through the documents, stamps, signatures, notarized seals. It was all perfectly legal. My grandfather had transferred the house to me years ago, quietly, cleanly, without telling anyone, because apparently he knew them. He knew how quickly loyalty could evaporate when money was involved. And suddenly, the equation changed. They'd wanted me to sacrifice my future for Brandon's wedding, but they'd forgotten one small detail. They were living in my house. I sat there for a long time, tracing my fingers over the embossed paper, my heart thudding against my ribs. When I finally emerged from the bedroom, Ethan was sitting on the couch, his phone buzzing with missed calls from both my parents and Brandon. He looked up, worried. "Babe, what is it?" I held up the deed, my voice steady as ice. "I own their house." He blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" I dropped the folder into his lap, watched his eyes widen as he flipped through the pages. Holy... Madison, this is real. Every word. He stared at me, open-mouthed. "So, what do you want to do?" I drew in a deep breath. I'm going to remind them who they're dealing with. But as I said it, another memory clawed its way forward. Brandon, standing there at the engagement party, smirking over his bourbon, not even bothering to look ashamed. Something about that look had felt calculated, like he'd been waiting for the whole thing to explode. It gnawed at me as I tried to sleep that night, tossing and turning until the pale dawn began creeping across the floorboards. By the next morning, I was staring into my coffee when Ethan sat beside me and gently said, "There's something else, isn't there?" I hesitated, pressing my fingers to my temples. I've always had this feeling that Brandon was hiding something bigger than just money troubles. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Like what?" I swallowed. "A few years ago, I heard rumors at one of the hospital fundraisers. that he'd been caught funneling donations meant for pediatric surgeries into his personal accounts. Ethan's jaw dropped. Jesus. I brushed it off. I wanted to believe it was just gossip. But now, after the way he acted at the party, I think my parents have been covering for him for years. Ethan shook his head. That's criminal. Madison, if that's true, he could lose his medical license. Go to prison. I stared into my coffee, my reflection rippling. Exactly. And just like that, the fight became bigger than a wedding. It became about justice, about truth, about finally dragging every last secret out into the daylight. I picked up my phone and dialed my lawyer, Samantha Ortiz, a fierce woman with a voice like velvet and a spine of pure steel. Sam, it's Madison. I need you to look into something for me. By the time I hung up, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I wasn't just taking back my future anymore. I was about to blow up the carefully curated facade my family had been hiding behind for decades, and I didn't care how many bridges I had to burn to do it. 3 days later, the letter went out. Thick, cream-colored paper. Gold-embossed Carter family crest at the top, the same crest my father loved to brag about at every country club dinner, like it meant we were royalty. Except this time, the letter wasn't from him. It was from me, and it was addressed to Charles and Donna Carter, informing them of an official change of ownership review for the property at 26 Parkside Avenue, Beacon Hill. No threats, no insults, just pure, sterile legal language. But I knew the weight those words would carry. I dropped the envelope in the mailbox myself, the metal door clanging shut like the sound of a final verdict. And for 2 days there was silence, until my phone rang. Madison, my mother's voice, sharp as shattered glass. What the hell is this envelope? I took a slow breath. It's about the house. Mom, she laughed, short and brittle. You're joking. We've lived here for over 20 years. You can't do this. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Boston skyline, blazing orange in the sunset. I own it. There was a pause so long, I could hear her breath catch on the other end. Then she whispered, "This is cruel. You don't mean to evict us, do you?" I closed my eyes. I mean to give you the same consideration you gave me when Dad hit me in front of 50 people and you stood there pretending it wasn't happening. Her voice pitched up, shaking. Madison, be reasonable. Your father's health isn't what it used to be. Where would we even go? This is our home. I clenched my jaw. And I was building mine, until you tried to rip it apart for Brandon's wedding. A beat of silence. Then she shrieked so loudly I had to pull the phone away from my ear. You're ungrateful. Evil. We should have never given you anything. You were always trouble. Madison always. I let her rant until her voice cracked into sobs. Then I said calmly, "You have 30 days," and hung up. Ethan looked at me across the kitchen counter, his eyes wide. "Jesus, you okay?" I nodded, feeling like my insides were shaking apart and solidifying all at once. I'm not done yet, because Samantha, my lawyer, had delivered more news. The rumors about Brandon, they weren't just rumors. Turns out, Samantha dug up documents showing that Brandon had been quietly diverting hospital charitable funds into shell accounts tied to a luxury condo project in Miami. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. And my parents had signed off on consulting agreements to help him cover it, all in the name of protecting the family reputation. I stared at the pages spread out on my kitchen table, the neat rows of figures, the bank account numbers. It felt like looking at a different language, one written in betrayal. Ethan let out a low whistle. "This is massive, Madison." I nodded, numb. "I'm filing an official report, and I'm sending Brandon a notice of pending legal action. He doesn't get to stand there, smirking in his tux. pretending he's the golden boy while he steals money meant for sick kids. I spent the next 24 hours drafting letters, affidavits, collecting every scrap of paper my grandfather had left behind. Ethan stayed up with me, brewing coffee, massaging my shoulders, his face tight with worry but never saying I should stop. Because he knew as well as I did if I didn't finish this, it would eat me alive. On the day I sent out Brandon's legal notice, I decided to deliver another blow to my parents. I had Samantha prepare a second letter, this one not just about ownership, but about intent to sell. Donna called again, sobbing, trying every guilt trip she could muster. What will people think? Madison, your father is already having chest pains over this. Are you trying to kill him? I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. I'm not trying to kill him. Mom, I'm trying to survive him. She made a choked sound. We gave you everything. I snapped. You took everything. My childhood. My self-respect. And now you tried to take my future, too. And for what? So Brandon can throw a circus and impress the Blakes. So you can keep pretending we're some perfect family. I'm done pretending. Her voice dropped to a hiss. You'll regret this. I smiled bitterly. No, Mom, you will. And I hung up. That night, I crawled into bed beside Ethan, my body trembling with exhaustion. He gathered me close, pressing his lips to my temple. I'm proud of you, he whispered. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to keep the tears from spilling. Because for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my wedding. I was fighting to finally be free. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing outside the glittering ballroom of the Grand Harbor Hotel in downtown Boston, the same place where half the city's power brokers seemed to be gathering that night. Brandon and Sophia's wedding, a wedding I hadn't even wanted to attend, but something inside me told me I needed to be there. Not for Brandon, not for my parents, for myself. Ethan adjusted the lapels of my crimson jumpsuit as we stood in the entryway under the glow of thousands of tiny crystal lights. You look incredible, he murmured, eyes dark with pride. Thanks, I said, smoothing the fabric over my hips. Let's go ruin a perfect evening. We stepped into the ballroom, and for a moment, everything felt suspended the chandeliers, the sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns. The distant sound of a string quartet. People noticed me instantly. Some whispered, some stared. Brandon was at the far end of the room, posing for photos with Sophia. He spotted me over the heads of the crowd, and I saw his smile falter. Good. Donna was near the cake table, wearing navy silk and a look of utter panic. Charles stood stiffly beside her, cheeks blotched red as he glared at me like I'd just spat on the flag. Ethan kept his hand on the small of my back as we wove through the guests. Halfway across the ballroom, Sophia suddenly stepped away from Brandon and intercepted me. Madison, she said quietly. Can we talk? Her green eyes were sharp as cut glass. I lifted my chin. Sure. She pulled me toward a quiet alcove near a bank of floor-to-ceiling windows, the harbor twinkling darkly beyond the glass. Sophia folded her arms, voice low. I know what happened at your engagement party. The video went everywhere. I tensed, but she held up a hand. Brandon told me his version, but I don't believe him anymore. I blinked. Excuse me. Sophia took a deep breath, glancing back at Brandon, who was distracted talking to some older relatives. He thinks I'm an idiot, but I know he's hiding things. I've seen him sneaking out late. I found credit card charges at a casino in Connecticut. And a few weeks ago, I found text messages on his phone from other women. A tiny gasp slipped out of me. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away fiercely. I'm marrying him today because I have to. Our families are too intertwined, too many deals on the line. But Madison, I'm not letting him touch my trust fund. I've already spoken to my lawyer, and if you're going after him legally, I want to help. For a second, all I could do was stare at her. Then I said, voice low, Sophia, you don't deserve this. You deserve better. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Tell me something I don't know. She squeezed my hand. Just do what you have to do. And then she turned, lifted her chin, and glided back toward the crowd as though nothing had ever happened. I followed her with my eyes, my pulse thudding, because now I had an ally I hadn't even expected. Ethan slipped back to my side. Everything okay? Better than okay, I murmured. The officiant was calling everyone to take their seats for the ceremony. I settled into a chair near the aisle, my red jumpsuit stark among all the pastels and pearls. Brandon stepped up onto the small white platform, Sophia beside him in a gown of shimmering champagne silk. His eyes flicked over the guests, until they landed on me, and I saw panic ripple through him. The ceremony began, the officiant's voice echoing through the hush. When the moment came for Brandon to say his vows, he stumbled over Sophia's name. People tittered nervously. Sophia didn't flinch. She stared straight ahead, a perfect bride. But her knuckles were white around the bouquet. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, polite applause broke out. Brandon leaned in to kiss her. Sophia turned her cheek. The room buzzed with uneasy whispers. At the reception, Brandon tried to approach me, drink in hand, smile forced. Madison, glad you could finally show your face. I tilted my head. Enjoy your honeymoon. Brandon, I said softly, because when you get back, subpoenas are waiting. He blinked. What the hell are you talking about? I leaned closer, letting my voice drop to an icy whisper. You stole money from sick kids, and your parents helped you hide it. It's over. His jaw worked furiously, his face turning an alarming shade of red. You're bluffing. I smiled. Check your mail when you land. Oh, and one more thing. I paused, savoring the silence stretching between us. Mom and Dad, they're losing the house. That's mine now. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I turned my back on him and walked away, my heels clicking like gunshots across the marble. Behind me, I heard the glass in his hand shatter as it fell, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The following weeks moved like a blur. A week after the wedding, the subpoenas went out. Brandon's name hit the local news, splashed across headlines with words like embezzlement, charity fraud, and medical license under review. Every time I turned on the TV, his face was there, the once perfect surgeon, now labeled a thief. Charles and Donna tried to spin the story. They told distant relatives that I'd fabricated everything out of spite, that I was mentally unstable, that I was ruining the family. But the paper trail didn't lie. Bank statements, wire transfers, shell corporations tied to Brandon's name. Even my parents' signatures appeared on several documents, proving they'd tried to bury the evidence. 2 weeks after that, a bright red notice was posted on the front door of 26 Parkside Avenue. Property sold, vacate within 30 days. Neighbors whispered behind manicured hedges. Old friends crossed the street to avoid my mother's gaze. One crisp October morning, I stood on the sidewalk as movers carried out antique furniture, crystal vases, and stacks of framed family photos. Donna sobbed uncontrollably, clutching a silk scarf to her chest. Charles glared at me as if he wanted to set me on fire with his eyes. I kept my arms folded, the Boston wind whipping my hair across my cheeks. Charles finally exploded. You think this is fair? Madison, after all we've done for you. I met his stare, my voice quiet but unshakable. No, none of this is fair. Neither was getting slapped in front of 50 people, or being told my life didn't matter next to Brandon's. This is consequence. He opened his mouth like he was going to spit another insult, but no words came out. Donna's sobs turned to gasping hiccups. We gave you everything, she wailed. I took a step closer, my voice dropping. No. You gave me a childhood built on secrets and silence, and you tried to make me pay for your mistakes. I'm done paying. I turned my back as they watched the movers load the last box into the truck. As they drove away, I felt this strange mixture of triumph and mourning. Because yes, I'd won, but I'd lost something too. The tiny piece of me that still believed my parents could ever love me unconditionally was gone. Later that night, Ethan found me sitting on our living room floor, surrounded by boxes. He knelt beside me, tipping my chin up so I'd look at him. "They didn't deserve you," he whispered. "They never did." I tried to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. Tears finally spilled down my cheeks. "It shouldn't feel like grief, but it does," I said, my voice shaking. Ethan pulled me into his arms, pressing his forehead to mine. "That's because you're human. You're allowed to grieve, even when it's the right thing to walk away." I buried my face in his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of cedar and coffee. He pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. "I know you're hurting," he said softly. "But, Madison, you didn't destroy your family. You exposed what was already broken." My chest tightened, a sob catching in my throat. He kissed me gently. "And no matter what happens next, you're not alone." Somewhere deep inside me, the steel that had carried me through the past months began to soften. Just a little. I wasn't naive enough to think healing would happen overnight. But for the first time in years, I could imagine a life where my name didn't come with invisible chains. A life where my worth wasn't measured by how useful I could be to someone else's ambition. And as I curled up beside Ethan that night, the city lights glittering beyond our windows, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a life I finally chose for myself. 3 months later, I stood behind a podium in a glass-walled conference center overlooking Boston Harbor. My palms were damp against the wood. A sea of faces stared back at me. Business leaders, non-profit founders, journalists scribbling notes, women of every age sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting for me to speak. The overhead lights were warm, almost blinding, but I could feel Ethan's gaze from the front row, steady and grounding. I cleared my throat, the microphone crackling softly as I leaned in. "My name is Madison Carter, and I used to believe that family meant protection, loyalty, unconditional love." A hush fell over the room. But sometimes the people who raise you are also the ones who try to erase you. A ripple of soft murmurs moved through the crowd. I paused, glancing down at the shimmering harbor below. 3 months ago, I was slapped by my father in front of 50 people at my own engagement party because I refused to give up the money my grandfather left me, so my brother could have a lavish wedding. And for years before that, I stayed silent, because I thought silence meant keeping the peace. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes, the memories pressing against my ribs. But silence doesn't keep the peace. It buries the truth, and it convinces you that your needs, your boundaries, your entire future are negotiable. Someone in the second row let out a quiet sob. I took a deep breath. When I finally said no, my family turned on me. They tried to break me, humiliate me. And for a while, I thought they had. I thought the only way to survive was to disappear. My voice dropped, but then I remembered something my grandfather told me. Blood can betray you faster than strangers. Keep your own name on what matters. I lifted my chin, and I realized I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my life for people who only saw me as a resource to be drained. I wasn't obligated to set myself on fire to keep others warm. A wave of quiet nods rippled through the audience. My brother lost his medical license. My parents lost the house they tried to steal from me. And I lost any illusions that love alone would save me from betrayal. I paused, the silence stretching long and thick. But here's what I gained. I placed my palms flat on the podium, leaning forward. I gained freedom. I gained clarity. I gained the chance to build a life on my terms, not theirs. A murmur of agreement rose around me, and I founded Second Chance House, a shelter and empowerment center for women who've been betrayed by the people they trusted most. The place now stands where my childhood home once did, and every brick, every window, every key was paid for by the same money my parents once tried to steal. A few people gasped, hands flying to their mouths. I let a faint smile tug at my lips. It wasn't revenge, it was rebirth. The applause started softly, like rain, then rolled into thunder. I stepped off the stage, my legs trembling, my heart beating so loudly I could barely hear the clapping. Ethan was there waiting, pride shining in his eyes. He pulled me into his arms. "You were brilliant," he whispered. I breathed him in, closing my eyes for one long, trembling second. When I opened them, a young woman stood nearby, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Madison, your story saved me," she choked out. "My dad tried to make me give up my college fund for my brother's business. I thought I was the selfish one. I thought I was the problem." I felt my own eyes sting as I reached for her hands. "You are not the problem," I said firmly, "and you deserve a future that's yours." She sobbed and hugged me so tightly it nearly knocked the wind out of me. And as I stood there, surrounded by strangers who felt like sisters, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not because I'd won, but because I'd finally stopped losing myself. Later that night, Ethan and I stood outside under the glow of harbor lights. He laced his fingers through mine. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked softly. I stared out at the waves rolling in under the moonlight. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I wonder if there was a way to fix it all without tearing everything apart." Ethan's thumb brushed across my knuckles. "But then I remember. If I hadn't burned those bridges, I'd still be trapped on the other side." I turned to him, my voice low but certain. "And here's what I've learned. We are not what they did to us. We are what we choose to build from it." A breeze lifted my hair off my shoulders, and as Ethan kissed me under the stars, I finally felt free.